I will not come to your palace. You must come to me. It is you who should pay homage, not I."
She was the last pharaoh of Egypt, a queen whose beauty toppled empires and whose love affairs changed the course of history. Her name was Cleopatra, a woman who faced Rome itself, armed with nothing but her intellect, her charm, and an unshakable will to rule. Throughout Egypt's long history, there have always been women who rose to the top of the nation's political life. In the land of the pharaohs, a civilization with one of the richest heritages on earth, these women often wielded immense power. Yet when we speak of Egypt's queens, one name inevitably comes to mind: Queen Cleopatra, a ruler whose legendary beauty, intelligence, and influence made her one of the most controversial figures in all of ancient history. But before we turn to the story of this remarkable queen, let's first take a brief look at Egypt's broader past. As early as 3000 BCE, Egypt stood as a unified kingdom. Over the centuries, countless pharaohs ruled this powerful civilization, a story that continued until the arrival of Alexander the Great and the Macedonians, who conquered the land of the pharaohs. Egypt's history is so vast and layered that scholars today divide it into distinct eras. The first great chapter began around 3100 BCE, when a man named Menes, also known as Narmer, unified Upper and Lower Egypt and became the first pharaoh. This moment marked the beginning of ancient Egypt's dynastic rule. People of that time believed the pharaohs were descendants of the gods, divine beings with knowledge of heaven and the afterlife. The pharaoh's authority was absolute. He commanded the army, oversaw the nation's economy, and even dictated the people's spiritual life. Roughly 3 centuries after Menes, Egypt had become a superpower of the ancient world. Many of its most iconic monuments, the temples, tombs, and pyramids, were built during this era. Yet this golden age did not last forever. Rival royal families clashed for power, and internal strife eventually plunged the nation into chaos. By around 2000 BCE, Egypt regained stability and entered a new period of prosperity, especially in the arts and jewelry making. The country flourished as a great center of trade, and the cities and architecture of the Nile Valley transformed. During this time, Egypt became one of the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world. However, this progress ended with the invasions of foreign powers. While Egypt excelled in culture and commerce, it had neglected military innovation. When foreign armies, armed with superior weapons, invaded, Egypt's forces were defeated. This era, defined by rebirth, brilliance, and eventual decline, is known as the Middle Kingdom. After the Middle Kingdom came what historians call the New Kingdom, an age when Egypt was ruled by corrupt priests. The temples had become lavish and extravagant, and new gods seemed to appear almost every day. It was an age of divine confusion. Yet, paradoxically, it was during this very era that Egypt finally embraced the idea of monotheism. This shift began with a pharaoh named Amenhotep IV, the man who first introduced the worship of a single god to Egypt. Until then, the Egyptians had been a polytheistic people, but Amenhotep believed in only one deity, Aten, the sun god. To his people, the idea of worshiping just one god was revolutionary, almost shocking, yet it fascinated them. Before Amenhotep, the most powerful deity in Egypt had been Amun. Determined to turn the people's attention away from Amun and the corrupt priests who served him, Amenhotep ordered the destruction of Amun's great temple. It was a bold, radical act that deeply threatened the priest's wealth and authority. Though courageous, Amenhotep's reforms were short-lived. After his death, his statues and monuments were destroyed, and the priests quickly restored the old polytheistic system. Even his name was erased from the official list of pharaohs, and later rulers branded him a criminal and a heretic. If monotheism had survived, the Egyptian priesthood would have lost its vast power. At that time, Egypt had over 2,000 gods, most of them with animal-like forms, images still visible today in temple carvings and tomb walls. Worshippers brought lavish offerings to these gods, and as a result, the priests became immensely wealthy. Their riches and influence depended entirely on keeping the people faithful to many gods. The temples themselves were colossal, some as large as entire cities, and all their wealth came from the people's gifts. This wealth flowed either to the temples or to the pharaoh, depending on the relationship between king and clergy. If the pharaoh and the priests were on good terms, much of that fortune went to the royal court. Ramses II and the rise of the empire. Amid all this, Egypt entered the reign of Ramses II, known to history as Ramses the Great. He ruled for nearly 70 years, bringing stability, strength, and grandeur to Egypt. His reign marked the height of the new kingdom's power. Yet after his death, Egypt never fully regained that glory for nearly 9 centuries to come. Over time, Egypt became a battlefield for foreign powers: the Persians, Assyrians, Romans, and finally the Ptolemies. When Alexander the Great invaded, he annexed all of Egypt into his expanding empire. But Alexander's life was short. He died young, and his vast empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to one of them, Ptolemy I, Soter, who declared himself Pharaoh of Egypt. His dynasty, the Ptolemaic line, ruled for nearly 3 centuries. The early years were prosperous, but the last 200 years were filled with weakness and decline. During this period, Rome's eyes were fixed on Egypt. The Romans coveted its wealth, its grain, and its strategic position. As Egypt's central government weakened, Rome saw its chance. Local rulers constantly fought each other, and whenever they failed to resolve their conflicts, they turned to Rome for help. This dependence on foreign powers only hastened Egypt's collapse, and it was in this age of turmoil that Cleopatra was born. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra was the daughter of Ptolemy XII. Her father, realizing that Egypt was in decline, placed his hopes for the nation's revival in her hands. From an early age, Cleopatra was entrusted to the best scholars and tutors in the kingdom. Under Egyptian law, women were not allowed to rule independently. To overcome this, dynasties often created legal solutions, one of which was co-rule through marriage within the royal family. Cleopatra excelled in her studies, and by the time she came of age, her father saw her as the best candidate to inherit the throne. But Egypt at that time was also home to one of the most ruthless and blood-stained dynasties in history. For 300 years, the Ptolemies had ruled through intrigue, betrayal, and murder. Political disputes were settled not through negotiation, but assassination. Fathers killed sons, brothers killed sisters, and the corridors of the royal palace were littered with blood. In ancient times, marriage among close relatives was common among royal families, intended to preserve the purity of the bloodline. Cleopatra's own parents were likely related. Her mother is believed to have been her father's niece. When Ptolemy XII died, Cleopatra succeeded him, becoming Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt. By law, a woman could not rule alone. She needed a male co-ruler, usually her brother or husband. And so Cleopatra was forced to marry her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, and share the throne. Outwardly, they ruled together, but beneath the surface, Each plotted against the other. Cleopatra had the upper hand. She was older, more experienced, and supported by many of her father's former allies. She ordered that her brother's name be erased from official records and that coins be minted bearing only her image. But her young brother was not powerless. He had advisors of his own and was determined to fight back. Cleopatra lived in constant fear of poisoning. She had her servants test her meals before eating. History had shown what became of shared thrones in Egypt. One ruler always had to die. Eventually, a conspiracy forced Cleopatra to flee Egypt with her sister. Her brother seized power and became Ptolemy XIII. During Cleopatra's exile, Rome was torn by a civil war between two of its greatest generals, Pompey and Julius Caesar. Pompey was defeated and fled to Alexandria. Caesar pursued him there. Hoping to impress Caesar, young Ptolemy XIII ordered Pompey's execution and sent Caesar his severed head as a gift, but the plan backfired spectacularly. Caesar, horrified, saw the act not as loyalty but as barbarism. He broke all ties with Ptolemy XIII. When Cleopatra heard of this, she realized her moment had come. If she could win Caesar's support, she might reclaim her throne. Using her wit, courage, and legendary charm, she secretly returned to Egypt and arranged one of the most famous encounters in history. The midnight meeting between the 21-year-old queen and the 52-year-old Roman general. Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome and one of its most notorious lovers, was captivated. He knew exactly what Cleopatra wanted, and she knew what she was offering in return. Their alliance was political, sensual, and mutually beneficial. Caesar would secure his influence over Egypt, and Cleopatra would regain her crown. When Ptolemy XIII learned of their relationship, it was too late. His plans were ruined. To prevent further conflict, Caesar declared Cleopatra and her brother co-rulers once again, hosting a grand banquet to celebrate the peace. But everyone at that table, every member of the royal family, knew it was an illusion. Behind every smile lurked betrayal. Cleopatra's partnership with Caesar gave her security, but it didn't last. Loyalists to Ptolemy rose in revolt, and soon the palace was under siege. Cleopatra, cornered, called for Caesar's help. The Roman legions crushed the rebellion. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. He was just 15. Cleopatra once again became Egypt's sole ruler, officially sharing power with her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, though in truth, she reigned alone. She was now queen, wife, and mother to Caesar's son Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar. In Egypt, the royal family was worshipped as divine, and Cleopatra embraced this fully, presenting herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis, whose tears, legend said, filled the Nile with water. A few months after Caesarion's birth, Cleopatra traveled to Rome. Her arrival caused a scandal. The Roman Senate despised her and saw her as nothing more than Caesar's mistress. Yet her influence over him was undeniable, so much so that Caesar ordered a statue of Cleopatra erected in one of Rome's temples. This act of devotion outraged his enemies. In 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated, stabbed to death in the Senate. For Cleopatra, his death was a devastating blow. She had lost her greatest ally and protector. Realizing Rome was no longer safe, she fled back to Egypt. Yet even there, she could sense danger looming. Rome's new leaders saw her as an enemy, and the empire's armies hungry for Egypt's gold were preparing for conquest. And it was in this rising storm that Mark Antony would appear. After Caesar's death, Rome plunged once more into civil war on one side, Caesar's supporters, including Mark Antony and Octavian. On the other, the new consuls of Rome, who were, in fact, the masterminds behind Caesar's assassination. Cleopatra backed Caesar's supporters, providing them with both financial and military aid. The war ended in their favor, and the Second Triumvirate was established. The three strongmen carved up the Roman world among themselves, each ruling a portion while preserving Rome's nominal unity. After their victory, some 300 of those involved in Caesar's murder were arrested and executed. Around this time, Cleopatra's younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, died suddenly at the age of 15. The exact cause is unknown, but many suspect poisoning, possibly at Cleopatra's direction, since her 3-year-old son was immediately proclaimed Ptolemy XV, Caesarion. At that very moment, Cleopatra found her new patron and partner, Mark Antony, one of Caesar's closest and most loyal men. In many ways, Antony resembled Caesar, especially in his appetite for luxury and excess. Like Caesar, he claimed noble descent, even from Heracles, and felt entitled to act as he pleased. For Cleopatra, this was an advantage. It gave her a clearer path to win Antony's favor. 3 years after Julius Caesar's death, Cleopatra sailed for the Mediterranean coast to meet Antony. She did everything necessary to captivate him, arriving on a gilded, perfumed ship, prepared in dazzling style. A Roman historian writing a century later described her seated in supreme beauty while handsome youths fanned her on a gold-trimmed barge. Antony, meanwhile, was counting the moments until he could see the Queen of Egypt. When Cleopatra reached shore, she sent Antony a message. "I will not come to your palace, you must come to me. It is you who should pay homage, not I." It was a bold gamble. Antony had many lovers. Such defiance could have ruined everything. But Cleopatra won the wager. Years earlier, with wit and allure, she had ensnared a man far greater, Julius Caesar. So Antony, besides Caesar, was no insurmountable challenge. Antony boarded the Queen's ship, and the two met. As before, both knew exactly what they wanted. Cleopatra sought Antony's protection. Antony wanted Egypt's wealth and resources for his legions. Under the pretext of trade with Alexandria, Antony traveled to Egypt and took up residence in Cleopatra's palace. There, night after night, they hosted lavish feasts so extravagant that they founded a club jokingly called the Inimitable Livers, devoted to wine and revelry. Antony reveled in Egyptian art and culture and, more than anything, fell deeply in love with Cleopatra. She, too, loved him. Between the enchantress Cleopatra and the enchanted Antony, a bond formed that history would never forget. Cleopatra's affair with Caesar had been calculated and political. Her relationship with Antony was the opposite. The further it went, the more romantic and emotional it became. That shared passion only tightened their pact. Antony saw himself as Caesar's heir in spirit, and his influence in Rome was immense. Thanks to that power, few dared to challenge Cleopatra or Egypt while Antony stood beside her. Back in Egypt, Cleopatra's family had long been at war with itself. She had outmaneuvered most rivals. The last remaining threat was a younger sister living in exile. At Antony's order, spurred on by Cleopatra, that sister was executed. With her death, Cleopatra had no rivals left. At 28, she stood at the height of her power and could finally pursue her true goal, to make Egypt an empire once more. Antony was so enthralled that he neglected Roman affairs. In his absence, his fellow triumvir Octavian, still in his early 20s but trained by Julius Caesar, told the Senate that Antony was a decadent libertine who cared nothing for Rome. Word of this reached Antony, and he sensed danger. Around this time, Cleopatra became pregnant by Antony. Though Antony honored his vows to Cleopatra, he had no choice but to leave Egypt and return to Rome. To preserve his fragile alliance with Octavian, Antony married Octavian's sister, a purely political union that produced a child but little affection. Next came one of Antony's most important campaigns, the invasion of Parthia, Iran, and war against the Parthian Empire. Cleopatra supported him fully with treasure and supplies. The plan was total conquest. 100,000 Roman soldiers, with 13,000 Armenian auxiliaries, advanced into Parthia in the dead of winter. The Parthian king Phraates IV met them with devastating Parthian tactics. What Rome intended as its greatest eastern triumph became its greatest eastern disaster. As the Romans withdrew, crossing the Araxes River and fleeing Parthian territory, they kissed the ground like shipwrecked survivors, weeping and embracing one another. The defeat was catastrophic for Rome, for Antony, and for Cleopatra. Even as Antony fathered more children with Cleopatra and left Octavian's sister, Octavian decided he would tolerate Antony no longer. With the Senate's backing, he declared war on Egypt. In 31 BCE, the first major clash came at sea, the Battle of Actium. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated and retreated to Alexandria. With that defeat, Cleopatra's grand vision began to crumble. A year later, Octavian captured Alexandria. The splendor of Egypt passed into Roman hands. Antony drowned his sorrows in wine, waiting for the inevitable Octavian's triumph and his own capture. Cleopatra lost faith that Antony could save her. Secretly, she sent her gold and jewels to Octavian, asking in return for the safety of herself and her children. But Octavian, at the height of his power, wanted more than treasure. He wanted all of Egypt and, above all, revenge on Antony. Some sources say Antony and Cleopatra had agreed that, if all was lost, they would die together. Cleopatra even tested various poisons on prisoners to learn which brought the swiftest, least painful death, preparing for a romantic end. They even joked about renaming their wine club the Society of Suicide. Antony tried one last time to rally his forces against Octavian, but his remaining commanders defected. Then a messenger arrived with shattering news. Cleopatra had killed herself. Mad with grief, Antony, who adored her, could not imagine life without her. He had no army, and now no love. He would perform the last act they had promised to share. On 1 August 30 BCE, Mark Antony took his own life. His body was carried to a tomb that had been prepared in advance, where Cleopatra was waiting, still alive. Taking Antony's hand, she produced an asp from a basket and allowed it to bite her. In this way, the two fulfilled their fateful pact. Cleopatra was 39 at her death. Octavian's plans to parade the lovers as trophies were ruined. With Cleopatra gone, her son Caesarion was proclaimed her successor, but his reign lasted only 11 days. At 17, he was executed on Octavian's orders. With the deaths of Cleopatra and Caesarion, the pharaonic system ended. Egypt became a province of Rome. In Rome, everything changed as well. The Republic collapsed entirely, and Octavian declared himself the first Roman emperor, taking the name Augustus. Thus ended the age of Cleopatra and began the age of empire.